this is our Dreadlock Origin Series Part 2. We're going to be talking about Elflocks from English folklore. When we use the term Elflocks, we're referring to the early Celts and druids of Britain, Wales and Scotland. But to see how and why, we have a few questions we've got to answer. Number one, we need to look at the origins and trace the term where it comes from. We're going to go back as far as we can and qualify these sources with cross-references. Number two, why Elflocks and what does it mean? Number three, how have Elflocks changed, developed and cultivated over the years and why? Welcome to Dreads UK. If you're new here and you are watching on YouTube, remember to click that subscribe button, hit that notification bell so you can stay updated with all this great content. And if you're a returning subscriber, you know we love you. Welcome back. The most common answer to the term what are Elflocks and where do they come from, you will often hear people say, Shakespeare. And this is true, but it's only a tiny snippet, a single framed image from a huge history. But we will cover that here, so let's begin with that.
This is that very mab that plats the manes of horses in the night, and bakes the Elflocks in foul sluttish hairs, which once untangled, much misfortune bodes.
In modern history, the earliest written record that we have is the term Elflocks in Shakespeare. This was sometime around 1595 to 1597 in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Here Shakespeare is referring to the folkloric term, so stories and songs passed around, but using a popular term that people of the time knew and recognised. And this is where we'll begin our journey. So this term can be found in Romeo and Juliet, Act 1, Scene 4, where Mercutio is attempting to deter his friend Romeo from his recent love interest. He explains Queen Mab, a sprite or pixie by description, creates these Elflocks, and as the verse goes, this is that very Mab that plats the manes of horses in the night, and bakes the Elflocks in foul sluttish hairs, which once untangled, much misfortune bodies. So let's unpack this text. We can see it highlights the fact that the hair is tangled or knotted by its needing to be untangled. This tells us right away that it's not just braids. The hair is tangled or matted. But additionally, we have a few key pointers here. Number one, that plats the manes of horses at night. In the aspect of horses, is it dreadlocks or is it braids? And is that relevant? At first, we see that this line refers to plaits. There are many cases of braids with horsehair surrounding superstition of witch knots in folklore. Dr. Melissa Harrington published a paper in 2016 entitled The Urban Folklore of Otherworldly Horse Mane Braiding and the Persistence of Superstition Regarding Witch Knots in Horses' Manes from Shakespeare to Spiritual Warfare. This is an excellent overview and totally deserves a mention. In mainstream media, there's a number of articles, unexplained occurrences with horsehair, even as late as 2011. In 2011, the BBC article highlights the myth of marking the horses for stealing. In 2010, the Argus in Brighton reported on witches being blamed for using knot magic on horses. Again in 2009, there is the Telegraph reporting that police blamed paganism for spells and knot magic. Even in communities completely unrelated to dreadlocks, like the equine community, give their account. These independent sources showcasing dreadlocks in their horses' hair and describing them as such, with supported photos. All of them with the same superstition tales of folklore, but those with a less superstitious leaning in equine today tend to use the term wind knots. That these in fact occurred naturally, with one owner highlighting that he lived on an offshore island and that plaits and dreadlocks still occurred. Dreadlocks and braids have been found in American Western, Arabian, Andalusian and Frisian horses. It stands to reason that while braids and dreadlocks occur in horses today, this would also be the case in the time of Shakespeare's writings. And back to Shakespeare, the next line says, and bakes the Elflocks in foul sluttish hairs. What's going on? And what picture is being painted? The fact Shakespeare uses the term Elflocks following on from plaits also confirms the case for locks as they're given two different names, but we also see the demonising of them using the descriptives foul and sluttish. But this would be a complete contrast of how religious practices tend to refer to themselves. It doesn't suggest its likely origin, as no one really demonises themselves. But it is notable that dreadlocks are being demonised here in the terms foul and sluttish. This goes some way as an insight into the impression people have of dreadlocks over the generations and how it changes. In India, jatta were worn by the holy sadhus. In Peru, it was warriors and priests. But witches, druids and Celts seem to have been given a negative description. Why? What's different? To unpack the history of Elflocks and its demonisation from mainstream society, we have to begin in AD 43 with the Roman conquest of Britain. During the reign of Cunobeline, the king of the Britons, this time brought the introduction of the Catholic Church, the enemy of Elflocks. Claudius of Rome invaded a place that today we all know as Dover in Kent, in what was then known as Cantanchi, from Frere's Britannia Atlas. The earliest evidence for the Britons and their language in historical sources date to the Iron Age, following this Roman invasion. When Rome invaded, it brought with it the Catholic Church, the Roman version of Christianity, which Rome used for power and conquest. Anything that was strange or unknown to Catholicism was just branded paganism, a blanket term used for anything that wasn't Catholic practice. This includes terms like heathens, so people that lived on the heath, wizards, originally just blacksmiths, see the Nebra sky disk from 1600 BC in the Bronze Age, and witches, originally women who had knowledge of plants and their health properties. Today, we'd probably just call them pharmacists. Can you imagine if a pharmacist travelled back in time, offering paracetamol in the Bronze Age? I've watched a few TV dramas recently with women who had medical knowledge and were perceived as witches. Versailles and Outlander, worth a watch. I'll leave links below at the end. This mysticism surrounding this knowledge was often referred to as magic by the common people. This is also echoed all over the world in all different types of belief and the rise of spirituality. This took a simple practice of use of the elements and turned it into a religious worship, the worship and praise of nature and the elements. I remember going to pick up a camper van a few years ago from Ireland, and on my way back I stopped at the Irish Natural Heritage Park in Wexford. They've got an amazing demonstration of how this progressed. But it was this spiritual practice that the Catholic Church sought to demonise. Anything that was to do with paganism was considered evil and beyond the pale of mainstream consumption. And yes, that very much meant dreadlocks. These witch knots, known commonly as Elflocks, became the subject of demonisation in mainstream society and has continued to this day in many parts of the world. Though today in our civilised society we're becoming increasingly more accepting of personal forms of expression, the dreadlocks addition into mainstream society and fashion has only taken place in very recent years. But this has been making huge changes in the way that dreadlocks are seen today. It is in fact a mission statement of Dreads UK and how it was founded. With the rise of the festival culture in recent years, this has also filtered over into mainstream society and fashion, giving way for a new acceptance of dreadlocks. Springing up in the 70s was the Glastonbury Music Festival, which was the 70s answer to the 60s hippie movement. The hardcore followers of this run through into the 80s, but still with much stigma from the mainstream.
In Wiltshire, after violent clashes between police and a convoy of hippies, the convoy crashed through roadblocks to try to get into an illegal pop festival.
Throughout the 90s was an era of dreadlocks in the mainstream pop industry, reminiscent of Elflocks. Artists like Big Mountain, Brandon Boyd from Incubus, right through to Faye Tozer from Steps. And you couldn't have got more mainstream pop than Faye Tozer from Steps in the 90s. We've done a whole video on that called Top 10 Musicians with Dreadlocks. I'll leave a link below. As we leave the 90s and move into the 21st century, festival culture boomed. And we saw the rise of the more avant-garde side of dreadlocks. The cyberpunks of the rave goth scene began adopting their interpretation of dreadlocks using tubular crin to mimic the dreadlocks. This look became a complete world of its own, coining the term cyberlocks. As more and more acceptance of diversity developed, this also inspired a more experimental design into the world of Elflocks. Synthetic dreadlocks become increasingly more popular for their many colour variations and ease of use. All of these aspects have contributed to the aid of acceptance for dreadlocks in mainstream culture, with dreadlocks becoming more and more the norm. Today we see such a burst of colour and creativity, many of which still identify with the Elflocks sentiment, some even referring to their own dreadlocks as Elflocks, largely in response to the uprising of the cultural appropriation argument. But thanks to that, we now know so much more. And the final line in Shakespeare's text, much misfortune bodies. Shakespeare, being rather dramatic, takes that superstition a little bit further, saying that if you remove your dreadlocks, woe betide you. It's not going to go well for you. But we've also seen that same sentiment in other places as well. In Native American culture, long hair was seen as power. It was said to have offered heightened sense of awareness, helping them to realise when the enemy was approaching, or for tracking. That when the hair was cut, they said they lost their abilities. In Samson, with the biblical Nazarite vow, we see his dedication not to cut the hair from his head. I'll put a link to that video too. Samson's Nazarite practice also eventually came to inspire the Rastas to adopt that same practice. Dreadlocks, Elflocks, sisterlocks, jatta, locks, whatever you call them, or whatever you believe, one thing is clear. Everyone who wears them tends to feel very passionately about them. Be it fashion or faith, spirituality, or just for fun. But how should we respond? Let us know in the comments your thoughts on all this. What's been your experience of dreadlocks? Have you experienced prejudice or demonisation for having dreads? And if you have, why? Why do you think it is? We'd love to know your thoughts. Until then, I hope this video was helpful. Don't forget to subscribe to the Dreads UK YouTube channel to follow our Dreadlock Origin series. Get all your Dreadlock education and tips and tricks. And also check out www.dreadsuk.com for all your Dreadlock products shipped worldwide.
Queen Mab? Who's she? She is the fairies' midwife. She comes in state, no bigger than an agate stone on the forefinger of an alderman, drawn with a team of little atomies athwart men's noses as they lie asleep. Her wagon spokes are made of long spinner's legs, and the cover of the wings of grasshoppers, the traces of the smallest spider's web, and the colours of the moonshine's watery beams.